I never should have taken that shortcut through Devil's Pass. The first blast of the horn jolted me awake, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. For a split second, I thought I'd dozed off at the wheel and hit the horn myself. But my hands were where they should be, clenched tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white in the green glow of the dashboard. The night pressed in around me, an inky blackness broken only by the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the fog. The clock on the dash blinked 3 a.m. in angry red numbers. I'd been on the road for nearly 20 hours straight, pushing to make a delivery deadline that suddenly seemed a lot less important. I pulled over to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. The engine idled, a comforting rumble in the silence. I needed to get my bearings, to shake off the cobwebs of fatigue and figure out where the hell I was. The map was useless. I'd gone off-route hours ago, lured by a promising shortcut through the mountains. Now I was lost in a maze of winding roads with no cell signal and a growing sense of unease. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus. That's when I noticed the smell, acrid and chemical, like burning plastic. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I sniffed, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from outside the cab. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed down from the truck. The night air was crisp, carrying a hint of pine. I swept the beam along the side of the trailer, looking for any signs of trouble. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to climb back in when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the trailer. My blood ran cold. I'd loaded this haul myself. 40 pallets of electronics securely strapped down. There shouldn't be anything moving back there. I approached the rear doors cautiously, my hand shaking as I reached for the latch. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to get back in the cab and drive. That's when the horn blared again. I whirled around, heart in my throat. The sound echoed off the hillsides, impossibly loud in the still night. But I was at least 20 feet from the cab. There was no way I could have accidentally hit it. I sprinted back to the driver's side door, yanking it open. The interior was exactly as I'd left it. The horn fell silent as suddenly as it had started. My hands were shaking as I pulled myself up into the seat. I slammed the door, feeling a little safer with the solid metal between me and whatever was out there. The thumping from the trailer had stopped too, leaving only the steady purr of the engine. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some kind of electrical short was triggering the horn. And the thumping, well, maybe I just imagined that part. I put the truck in gear, eager to put some miles between me and this stretch of road. The sooner I got back to civilization, the better. The fog seemed to thicken as I drove, swirling in my headlights like something alive. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I found myself hunching over the wheel, peering into the gloom for any sign of a turnoff or landmark. An hour passed. Then 2. The road twisted and turned, doubling back on itself in confusing loops. I should have hit a main highway by now, but there was nothing but endless forest and fog. The smell of burning plastic returned, stronger this time. I cracked the window, hoping some fresh air would help clear my head. That's when I realized the temperature had dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in front of my face, and frost began to form on the corners of the windshield. I cranked up the heater, but it made no difference. The cold seeped into the cab, numbing my fingers and sending shivers down my spine. The engine started to sputter, the RPMs dropping dangerously low. "No, no, no," I muttered, pumping the gas pedal. "Don't do this to me now." The truck lurched, coughing like a dying animal. I managed to guide it to the shoulder just as the engine died completely. Silence fell, broken only by the tick of cooling metal. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the useless gauges. This couldn't be happening. I had a full tank of diesel and the engine had been purring like a kitten all night. There was no reason for it to just die like this. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I reached for the key, determined to try and restart the engine. As my fingers touched the cold metal, the horn blared again. I jerked back, slamming my head against the seat. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cab, a mind-numbing wail that seemed to go on forever. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did little to muffle the noise. Just as suddenly as it started, the horn cut off. The silence that followed was almost worse. My ears rang, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the road ahead, barely visible through the fog. It was tall, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there. And it was closer now, much closer. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for the door handle, my numb fingers slipping on the metal. I had to get out, had to run. Anywhere was better than being trapped in this cab. The door wouldn't budge. I threw my shoulder against it once, twice, but it was like trying to move a mountain. I was locked in. The figure was at the front of the truck now, its featureless face pressed against the windshield. Frost spread from where it touched the glass, intricate patterns blooming across my field of vision. I scrambled into the sleeper cab, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. My back hit the rear wall, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had nowhere left to go. The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath hanging in the air, crystallizing before my eyes. The cold burned, seeping into my bones. I huddled into myself, shivering uncontrollably. That's when the whispering started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. They rose and fell in pitch, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices were inside my head now. Images flashed before my eyes, places I'd never been, faces I'd never seen. A woman crying in a room full of broken mirrors. A child standing at the edge of a cliff, arms outstretched. A door opening onto an endless void. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to go away. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The horn blared again and my eyes snapped open. The figure was gone. The frost was gone. The engine was running, gauges showing everything normal. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching as if I'd been in a fight. Sweat soaked my clothes, despite the lingering chill in the air. Had I fallen asleep? Dreamed it all? The clock on the dash read 3:01 a.m. Only a minute had passed since I'd first heard the horn. My hands shook as I put the truck in gear. Dream or not, I needed to get moving. I needed to get far away from this place. As I pulled back onto the road, something caught my eye. There in the rearview mirror was a face. Not my face, but that of an old man. His eyes milky white and unseeing. He smiled, revealing a mouthful of sharp, gleaming teeth. I blinked and he was gone. But the image was seared into my mind, as real as the road stretching out before me. I drove through the rest of the night, jumping at every shadow, flinching at every unexpected sound. When dawn finally broke, I found myself on a busy highway, surrounded by normal traffic and signs of civilization. I made my delivery on time, handed in my logbook, and walked away from trucking for good that day. Some roads, once traveled, change you forever, and some horns, once heard, never stop echoing in your dreams. Even now, years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m., half expecting to hear that horn. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to that lonely stretch of road. The moment I saw that signature, I knew I'd delivered something I shouldn't have, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It started like any other day on the road. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as I pulled out of the depot, my rig loaded with packages bound for the small towns dotting the Appalachian foothills. The manifest listed the usual assortment: Amazon boxes, medication from mail-order pharmacies, car parts for local mechanics. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except for one package. It was a small box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Old school. The address was handwritten in flowing script that looked like it belonged on a wedding invitation, not a package label. The destination? A place called Hollow Creek, a tiny dot on the map I'd never delivered to before. I should have known something was off right then. Should have trusted that prickle at the back of my neck. But after 15 years on the road, you learn to ignore those little warnings. They'll drive you crazy otherwise. The day wore on, the miles ticking by as I made my way through my usual route. The radio kept me company, classic rock and talk shows blending into white noise as the mountains loomed larger on the horizon. By late afternoon, I'd cleared most of my deliveries. All that was left was that little brown package and its out-of-the-way destination. The GPS led me off the main highway onto increasingly narrow roads. Pavement gave way to gravel. then to rutted dirt that had my rig creaking and groaning in protest. The trees pressed in close, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight into eerie patterns across my windshield. Just as I was starting to think I'd taken a wrong turn, I rounded a bend and saw it. Hollow Creek. The name fit. The village, if you could call it that, sat in a deep valley, the kind that probably never saw full sunlight. A handful of buildings huddled around a crossroads, weathered wood gone gray with age. No cars in sight. No people either. I pulled up in front of what passed for the general store, its faded sign barely legible. The package was addressed to M. Thorne, Hollow Creek General. Simple enough. The floorboards of the porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door, package in hand. A bell jangled as I stepped inside, the sound harsh in the stillness. The interior was dim, lit only by a few dusty windows. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods and household items that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded wrong somehow, like it was being swallowed up by the shadows. "Delivery for M. Thorne?" Movement in the back of the store caught my eye. A curtain shifted and a figure emerged from what I assumed was a back room. It was an old woman, her face a web of wrinkles, eyes milky with cataracts. She moved with a shuffling gait, aided by a gnarled wooden cane. "You have it, then?" Her voice was reedy, trembling with age or excitement. I couldn't tell which. I held up the package. "Delivery for M. Thorne, that you?" A smile spread across her face, revealing teeth too white and even for someone her age. "Indeed it is. I've been waiting a very long time for this." She reached for the package with hands that shook, her papery skin nearly translucent in the dim light. I pulled out my electronic signature pad, a habit born of thousands of deliveries. "Just need a signature, ma'am." The old woman's smile faltered. "Oh, no, dear. Not for this. This requires something more binding." Before I could react, she had the package in one hand and a wicked-looking letter opener in the other. The blade flashed and a line of red appeared across her palm. "What the hell?" I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a display of work boots. "Lady, what are you doing?" She ignored me, pressing her bleeding hand to the signature line of my digital pad. The blood smeared across the screen, a stark crimson against the gray background. "It is done," she whispered, her eyes fever-bright. "The circle is complete." I stared at the pad in horror, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't anything I'd ever encountered in all my years on the job. The old woman was already unwrapping the package, her bloodied hands leaving red smears on the brown paper. I knew I should leave, should get back in my truck and put this weird little town in my rearview mirror. But a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. The paper fell away, revealing a wooden box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The old woman's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. I caught a glimpse of something inside, something that gleamed wetly in the dim light, something that pulsed, my stomach lurched. Is that a heart?" The old woman's head snapped up, her milky eyes suddenly clear and sharp as a razor. "You've seen too much, Carrier." The room began to spin, colors bleeding into one another like a painting left out in the rain. I staggered, my legs suddenly weak. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the old woman's face, no longer wrinkled and aged, but smooth and terrible in its beauty. I woke to the sound of my own ragged breathing. I was in my truck, slumped over the steering wheel. Pale morning light filtered through the windshield, painting the world in shades of gray. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare born of too many hours on the road and too much gas station coffee. Then I saw the smear of dried blood on my digital signature pad. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a comfortingly normal sound in a world that had suddenly gone sideways. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of town, gravel spraying from my tires. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Hollow Creek as I could. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. A delivery receipt signed in blood. A package containing... what? A real heart? Some kind of prop or special effect? And what had the old woman, if she really was an old woman, meant about the circle being complete? I pulled over at a rest stop just across the state line, my nerves shot. I needed to report this, to tell someone what had happened. But who would believe me? I'd be laughed off the job, maybe even sent for a psych eval. As I reached for my phone, a notification popped up. A new delivery request, flagged as urgent. The destination made my blood run cold. Hollow Creek. Different address this time, different name. But the same handwritten script, the same brown paper package. My finger hovered over the accept button. Every instinct screamed at me to decline, to turn in my badge and find a nice, normal job that didn't involve blood signatures and mysterious packages. But deep down, I knew. Whatever had started in that little town, whatever dark purpose that package served, it wasn't over. And somehow, for better or worse, I was a part of it now. I hit accept. The engine rumbled to life and I pulled back onto the highway. The mountains loomed ahead, their shadows long in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in those hills, Hollow Creek waited, and this time, I'd be ready. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a delivery route now. It was a path I'd set my feet on, one that would lead me into darkness I couldn't begin to imagine, but I'd see it through, come what may. After all, I had a package to deliver, and in this line of work, the mail always goes through, even if it's signed for in blood. I should have known better than to trust a shortcut called Devil's Run. But when you're hauling 20 tons of frozen chicken and running 4 hours behind schedule, you'll take any chance to make up time. The CB crackled to life as I approached the turnoff. "Hey there, Nighthawk, you taking the run tonight?" I recognized Dusty's gravelly voice. He'd been driving these roads since before I was born. "That's a firm, Dusty. Gotta make up some time. Why, you got a better idea?" There was a long pause. Static hissed in the silence. When Dusty's voice came back, it was quieter than before. "Listen, kid, that road ain't natural, especially not this time of year. You'd be better off sticking to the highway." I laughed, more out of nervousness than anything else. "Come on, Dusty. Don't tell me you believe in all that superstitious nonsense. It's just a road through some farmland." "Suit yourself," Dusty replied. "But don't say I didn't warn you. And whatever you do, don't stop. No matter what you see or hear, just keep driving." The radio went silent. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over me. Dusty was just trying to spook me, that's all. Probably thought it was funny to mess with the new guy. The turnoff appeared suddenly, a narrow road that cut between two vast cornfields. A battered sign read, "Devil's Run, local traffic only." Below it, someone had spray-painted "Turn Back" in jagged red letters. I hesitated for a moment, Dusty's warning echoing in my mind, but the deadline loomed, and I could already imagine the chewing out I'd get if I arrived late. I made the turn. The moment my truck left the main road, the world seemed to change. The darkness pressed in closer, deeper somehow. My headlights barely penetrated the gloom, illuminating only a few yards of rough asphalt ahead. On either side, the corn rose up like walls, easily 10 feet high. The leaves rustled in a wind I couldn't feel, a dry, whispering sound that set my teeth on edge. I cranked up the radio, trying to drown it out, but there was nothing but static on every channel. The road twisted and turned, following no logic I could discern. It should have been a straight shot through the fields, but instead it meandered like a drunken snake. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, showing nothing but an empty void where the road should be. An hour passed, then 2. I should have cleared the farmland by now, should have reconnected with the highway. But there was nothing but corn, stretching endlessly in every direction. That's when I saw the first scarecrow. It loomed up suddenly in my headlights, a twisted figure lashed to a crude cross. Ragged clothes fluttered around a body that seemed too thin, too angular to be stuffed with straw. As I passed, I could have sworn its head turned to follow me. I blinked hard, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Had to be. But then I saw another, and another. Soon they lined the road, an honor guard of silent watchers. Some stood upright, others slouched at odd angles. A few were on their knees, faces turned up to the moonless sky. I fumbled for the CB, suddenly desperate to hear another human voice. "Dusty, you out there, anyone?" Nothing but static answered me. The engine coughed, a sudden lurching that sent a spike of fear through my gut. "Not here, please, not here." I coasted to a stop, the truck settling with a creak of suspension. For a moment I sat perfectly still, listening. The corn whispered. Something that might have been laughter drifted on the air, high and cruel. Dusty's words came back to me. "Don't stop, no matter what." I turned the key. The starter whined, but the engine refused to catch. Again, nothing. A tapping sound made me jump. It was coming from the passenger side window. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to pretend I hadn't heard. But my head turned almost of its own accord. A face peered in at me. Not a human face, but a crude approximation carved from a pumpkin. Firelight flickered in its eyes and grinning mouth. Behind it I could make out a scarecrow body, limbs oddly jointed and too long. It raised a hand, God, those fingers like twigs grown wrong, and tapped the glass again. I screamed. My foot slammed down on the accelerator. The engine roared to life as if it had never faltered. Tires spun, kicking up gravel, and then I was moving. The thing outside cocked its head, that terrible grin never wavering. As I pulled away, it raised one hand in a mocking wave. I drove faster than I ever had before, taking the twists and turns of the road at speeds that sent my rig swaying dangerously. The scarecrows were all moving now, writhing against their bindings or shuffling alongside the road on stiff legs. Faces flashed in my mirrors, pumpkins, corn husks, skull-like gourds. Things scuttled through the corn, always just out of sight. Cackling laughter and off-key singing drifted through my open windows. How long I drove, I couldn't say. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes bleeding into hours. I blew past intersections that led deeper into the maze, ignoring signs that promised shortcuts and exits. There was no way out but through. False dawn was just beginning to lighten the sky when I saw it. A gap in the corn, a proper road leading away from this nightmare. I yanked the wheel hard, tires screaming as I took the turn. The change was immediate. Suddenly, I was on a normal country road, the corn giving way to open fields. In my mirrors, I could see the entrance to Devil's Run receding, mist already obscuring it from view. I didn't slow down until I reached the highway, merging into early morning traffic that seemed impossibly, wonderfully normal. My phone chimed, suddenly full of panicked messages from dispatch asking where I was, why I'd gone dark. I pulled into a rest stop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the truck in park. The sun was rising properly now, painting the world in warm, comforting light. Birds sang. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the vending machines. When I finally worked up the courage to check my cargo, I found the seals unbroken. 20 tons of frozen chicken still at the perfect temperature, as if the night had never happened at all. Except for one thing. There, stabbed into the driver's side door, was a corn-husk doll. Its pumpkin head grinned up at me, dark eyes glittering. A note was pinned to its chest, written in a spidery hand, "Thanks for the ride. See you next harvest." I quit the next day, found a job that keeps me far away from corn country. But every now and then I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A flash of orange, a scarecrow's silhouette. And I'll drive a little faster, praying the harvest never comes. The first time I saw the numbers counting down, I thought I was losing my mind. Now, 3 days later, I'm starting to wish I had been. It all started on what should have been a routine haul from Tucson to Dallas. I'd made the run 100 times before, could practically drive it with my eyes closed. Not that I ever would, mind you. A lot of weird things can happen out there in the desert night. I just passed through El Paso, the city lights fading in my rear view, when I noticed something off about my dashboard. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything looked normal. Fuel gauge, oil pressure, engine temp. Then my eyes landed on the speedometer. The numbers were going backwards. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things. The caffeine from my last truck stop coffee must have finally worn off, leaving me punch-drunk and hallucinating. But when I looked again, the numbers were still ticking down. 75, 74, 73. My foot eased off the gas pedal instinctively. The truck began to slow, but the numbers kept falling at the same steady pace. This wasn't a speedometer anymore. It was a countdown. To what, I had no idea. But the gleaming red digits filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I pulled over, gravel crunching under my tires as I eased onto the shoulder. The engine idled, a comforting rumble in the desert silence. I leaned in close to the dashboard, studying the anomaly. The speedometer looked normal at first glance, same round gauge, same black numbers around the edge. But where the needle should have been, there was only a digital readout. 68, 67, 66. A coyote howled in the distance, making me jump. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. This had to be some kind of electrical glitch, maybe a short circuit or a blown fuse, nothing a mechanic couldn't fix. I reached for my phone, intending to call my dispatcher. No signal. Of course. With a sigh, I put the truck back in gear. I'd stop at the next town, find a garage, get this sorted out. No need to panic. As I pulled back onto the highway, the countdown ticked past 60. A shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, I had the overwhelming urge to drive faster, as if I could somehow outrun whatever waited at 0. The miles rolled by, desert scrub and rocky outcroppings passing in a blur. Towns appeared on the horizon, then vanished behind me. Each time I told myself I'd stop, get help, but some nameless fear kept my foot on the accelerator, my eyes locked on the ever-dwindling numbers. 50, 49, 48. A car approached from the opposite direction, the first I'd seen in hours. As it passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a middle-aged woman, her face eerily pale in the glow of her dashboard. For a moment, our eyes met. The look of terror on her face mirrored my own. Did she see it too? Was I not alone in this waking nightmare? The question haunted me as I drove on. The sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful, if you weren't watching your own personal doomsday clock tick away. 35, 34, 33. I blew past a sign welcoming me to New Mexico. How long had I been driving? My eyes burned with fatigue, my hands cramped around the steering wheel, but I couldn't stop, didn't dare to. A glance at my fuel gauge showed I was running on fumes. I'd have to stop soon, countdown be damned. As if in answer to my thoughts, a battered sign appeared on the roadside. Last gas for 200 miles. I took the exit, wheels squealing as I cornered too fast. The gas station looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Rusted pumps, faded signs, tumbleweeds crowding the cracked pavement. But it was open, and right now, that was all that mattered. As I pulled up to the pump, a man emerged from the station. He was ancient, his skin like sun-baked leather, eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He shuffled towards my truck with the slow, careful gait of the extremely elderly. "Help you?" His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the idling engine. I killed the ignition, wincing as I saw the numbers on the dashboard. 28, 27, 26. "Fill her up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And, you wouldn't happen to know a mechanic around here, would you? Having some trouble with my gauges." The old man's head tilted to one side, reminding me unnervingly of a curious bird. "Counting down, is it?" My blood ran cold. "How did you—" "Seen it before," he interrupted. "Long time ago. Truck like yours, driver about your age. Had the fear on him, same as you." "What happened to him?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The old man shrugged. "Don't rightly know. He filled up, drove off, never saw him again." He paused, seeming to study me from behind those thick lenses. "But I reckon you've got a choice to make, same as he did." "What choice?" "You can keep running," he said. "Try to outrace whatever's waiting at the end of that countdown. Might make it, might not. Or—" I waited, but he didn't continue. "Or what?" "Or you can face it, head on, whatever it is." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Face what? I don't even know what's happening to me." The old man nodded slowly. "None of us do, son. That's the point." He turned away, beginning to fill my tank with agonizing slowness. I watched the numbers on the pump climb, acutely aware of the ones ticking away on my dashboard. 20, 19, 18. When he finished, I handed over a fistful of crumpled bills, not bothering to count them. "Which way did the other guy go?" I asked. The old man pointed down the highway towards the endless expanse of desert. "Straight on," he said, fast as his rig could take him. He hesitated, then added, "Other way leads up into the mountains. Might be worth a look." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I climbed back into the cab, the old man called out, "Whatever you choose," he said, "make it count." The engine roared to life, the countdown resuming its relentless march. 15, 14, 13. I sat there for a long moment, watching heat shimmer off the desert highway. It would be so easy to just drive, to convince myself I could outrun this, whatever it was. But the old man's words echoed in my mind. Make it count. With a deep breath, I put the truck in gear and turned towards the mountains. The road wound upwards, switchbacks carrying me higher and higher. The air grew cooler, thin clouds wreathing the peaks ahead. My ears popped as I climbed, the pressure building like the tension in my chest. 5, 4, 3. The top of the pass came into view, a gap between two towering cliffs. Beyond it, I could see nothing but open sky. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel, guiding the truck around the final bend. 2, 1. I closed my eyes as I crested the summit, bracing for, I don't know what, an explosion, a crash, the end of everything. Instead, there was only silence. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The world looked different. Brighter somehow, colors more vivid than I remembered. I looked down at the dashboard. The speedometer was normal again, the needle pointing steadily at 0 miles per hour, but something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the suddenly lighter weight of my body. I stepped out of the cab on shaky legs, looking around in wonder. The view was breathtaking. Mountains stretching to the horizon, valleys lush and green below. And there, parked a little way down the road, was another truck. As I watched, the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, the woman I'd passed on the highway. She turned, saw me, and smiled. Behind her, I could see other vehicles. A minivan, a motorcycle, an ancient station wagon, all with drivers emerging, all wearing the same expression of relief and awe. I don't know what happened on that mountain pass. Don't know if we died or were reborn or simply crossed over into something new. But as I stand here watching the sun rise on a world that feels full of possibility, I know one thing for certain. Whatever was counting down, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The detour sign made no sense, but neither did anything else about this godforsaken night. I squinted at the orange placard through the haze of exhaustion and raindrops on my windshield, certain I was hallucinating. Ruoted. It took my tired brain a moment to realize the letters were backwards. A prank, maybe? Some bored teenagers with too much time on their hands? But as I peered into the darkness beyond my headlights, I saw a line of identical signs stretching into the distance, each one a mirror image of normality. I'd been on the road for 18 hours straight, pushing through the night to make a delivery deadline that suddenly seemed a lot less important. The GPS had gone haywire an hour back, insisting I was driving across an ocean. The radio picked up nothing but static, occasionally broken by bursts of what sounded like backwards speech. Now this. Part of me wanted to ignore the signs, to keep barreling down the main highway toward familiar territory. But a fallen tree blocked the road ahead, its massive trunk illuminated by flashing hazard lights. There was no way around it. With a resigned sigh, I downshifted and turned onto the detour. The moment my wheels left the main road, the world seemed to shift. The rain, which had been a steady downpour, now fell upwards, drops rising from my windshield into the night sky. The trees lining the road looked wrong somehow, their branches reaching down instead of up, leaves clustering near the roots. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was just tired, that's all. Seeing things. I fumbled for my thermos, hoping another slug of coffee would help. But when I raised it to my lips, the liquid defied gravity, pooling against the lid. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice sounding strange in the unnatural quiet. A glance at the dashboard clock told me it was 11:49 p.m. As I watched, the digital numbers ticked backward. 11:48, 11:47. The headlights of an oncoming car appeared in my rearview mirror, growing smaller as it approached. It passed me going backwards, the driver's pale face turned toward me in an expression of wide-eyed shock. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. I was asleep at the wheel, my subconscious mind spinning out some bizarre anxiety dream. Any moment now, I'd wake up to the blare of a horn as I drifted into oncoming traffic. But I didn't wake up. The backwards world persisted, getting stranger with each mile. Road signs warned of Da Hyrasts and Egderb Warren. Houses appeared, their structures inverted, chimneys sprouting from foundations while roofs burrowed into the earth. I tried to turn back, to retrace my route to the main highway, but each time I spun the wheel intending to pull a U-turn, my truck responded by driving in reverse. Forward was backward, left was right, and I was growing increasingly certain that I'd driven off the map into some twilight zone where the normal laws of physics didn't apply. The first human I saw was an old woman walking backwards along the roadside. Her clothes were odd, not vintage exactly, but subtly wrong in a way I couldn't quite pin down. As I passed, she turned her head, revealing a face that was young, impossibly young, like a child wearing a Halloween mask of wrinkles and age spots. She smiled, and I felt my blood run cold. Her Her teeth were backwards, the sharp incisors where molars should be. I drove faster. Towns appeared and vanished, their names unpronounceable jumbles of reverse letters. The buildings grew older as I progressed, evolving in reverse from sleek modern structures to quaint Victorian houses to crude log cabins. I passed horse-drawn carriages moving backwards, their occupants staring at my truck with undisguised terror. The road deteriorated, pavement giving way to gravel, then to rutted dirt. The signs were hand-painted now, their warnings inscrutable. My truck shuddered and groaned, parts I didn't know it had protesting this journey into an ever more distant past. I don't know how long I drove. Time had lost all meaning, the dashboard clock spinning backwards at an ever-increasing rate. I saw glimpses of things in the depths of the forests I passed, shapes that defied description, creatures that had no place in any sane reality. Just as I was certain I'd reached the beginning of time itself, I rounded a bend and saw myself. There I was, sitting in my truck at the start of this nightmarish detour. I watched as I read the sign, confusion evident on my face. Watched as I turned onto this impossible road. As my past self drove away, the world lurched. Suddenly I was back in my own body at the moment of decision. The detour sign loomed before me, its backwards text a warning I now understood all too well. This time I didn't turn. I threw the truck into reverse, backing away from the detour sign as quickly as I dared. The fallen tree that had blocked my path was gone. Had it ever really been there? I didn't stop to question it, just got back on the main highway and drove. I drove through the rest of that night and well into the next day, terrified that if I stopped, I'd find myself back in that backwards world. It wasn't until I crossed the state line, the familiar skyline of my destination city appearing on the horizon, that I finally began to relax. As I pulled into the delivery depot, 12 hours late and badly in need of a shower and about a week's worth of sleep, my boss stormed out of the office. His face was red, veins bulging in his neck as he prepared to unleash what I was sure would be an epic tirade about deadlines and responsibilities. I just held up a hand, cutting him off before he could start. "Trust me," I said, my voice hoarse from too much coffee and not enough sleep. "You don't want to know." He must have seen something in my face, some echo of the impossibilities I'd witnessed, because he backed off. Told me to go home, get some rest. Said we'd sort it out tomorrow. I nodded gratefully and climbed back into my truck. As I turned the key, my eyes fell on the dashboard clock. For a heart-stopping moment, I saw the numbers tick backwards, but then I blinked and it was normal again. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. Had to be. I pulled out of the depot and headed for home, sticking to familiar roads and well-lit streets. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I'd brought back some small piece of that backwards world with me. It was there in the moments just before sleep when I'd see my darkened bedroom in reverse, furniture on the ceiling, door hinged on the wrong side. It was there in my dreams, where I relived that endless night, driving deeper and deeper into a past that never was. And it was there in the mirror each morning, where for just a split second I'd see my reflection with those strange backwards teeth. I don't take detours anymore. Don't deviate from my planned route for any reason. Some might call it paranoia, but I know the truth. Sometimes the road less traveled is less traveled for a reason. And some journeys, once begun, can never truly end. They just run in reverse, an endless loop of what-ifs and might-have-beens, always leading back to that one fateful turn. Rooted, detour, a warning and a promise, another chance to make a different choice. I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last autumn. It was the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. Even now, months later, I break out in a cold sweat just thinking about it. But I need to tell someone, anyone who'll listen. Maybe then I'll finally be able to sleep through the night again. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Seattle. The leaves were turning, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. Normally, I love this time of year, the crisp air, the smell of wood smoke, the promise of the holidays just around the corner. But something felt off from the moment I pulled out of the depot. The sky hung low and heavy, a solid wall of gray that seemed to press down on my rig. The air felt charged, like right before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a hint of rain. I shrugged it off, cranked up some Merle Haggard, and settled in for the long haul. The first day was uneventful. I made good time, stopping only for fuel and a quick bite at a truck stop just outside of Des Moines. As night fell, I pulled into a rest area in western Nebraska to grab some shut-eye. That's when things started to get strange. I woke up around 3 a.m., startled out of a deep sleep by something. I couldn't put my finger on what had jolted me awake, but my heart was racing. The cab felt ice cold, even though I'd left the heat running. My breath fogged in front of me as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just quiet, I mean absolute total silence. No rumble of distant traffic, no whisper of wind, not even the usual creaks and groans of the truck settling. It was like someone had thrown a thick blanket over the whole world. Feeling uneasy, I decided to do a quick walk around, stretch my legs, and clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The moment my boots hit the asphalt, I knew something was wrong. The beam of my flashlight seemed dim, barely penetrating the darkness. The rest area, which had been half full when I'd pulled in, was now completely deserted. Not another vehicle in sight. Even the lights in the bathroom building were out. I walked slowly around my rig, playing the flashlight over the familiar contours. When I reached the passenger side, I froze. There, etched into the dust and grime on the door, was a symbol. It looked like a circle with a jagged line through it, surrounded by what might have been letters in some language I'd never seen before. My first thought was that some kid had been messing around, drawing in the dirt like they often do. But this was different. The lines were too precise, too deep. It was almost as if they'd been carved into the metal itself, only becoming visible through the layer of road dust. I reached out, my hand shaking to touch the marking. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. I yanked my hand back with a yelp that echoed unnaturally in the still night air. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the cab, my eyes darting left and right, searching the shadows. I half expected to see someone or something watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just that oppressive, unnatural silence. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe it was just a weird prank. I decided to try and get a few more hours of sleep before hitting the road again. Big mistake. I woke again just as the first gray light of dawn was creeping across the sky. For a moment, I thought everything was back to normal. I could hear birds chirping, the distant hum of cars on the highway. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking the night's strangeness had just been a vivid dream. Then I looked out the windshield and my blood ran cold. The entire front of my truck was covered in those symbols, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, etched into every surface. The hood, the fenders, the bumper, even the windshield itself was marked, though I could have sworn it had been clear when I'd fallen asleep. I scrambled out of the cab, nearly falling in my haste. The markings were everywhere. Down the sides of the trailer, across the rear doors, even on the tires. Some were small, no bigger than a dime. Others were massive, spanning the entire length of the trailer, and all of them had that same unsettling precision. I stood there, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It would have taken a team of people hours to create these markings, and I was certain I would have heard something. But I'd been asleep for barely 3 hours, and I've always been a light sleeper. As I circled the truck, I noticed something else. The symbols seemed to be moving, not physically shifting, but almost pulsing, like they were alive somehow. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But every time I looked, I could swear they had changed slightly, rearranging themselves in subtle ways. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my truck. The sun had fully risen by the time I snapped out of it, realizing that other drivers were starting to pull into the rest area. I waited for someone to notice, to say something about the impossible markings covering every inch of my rig. But nobody did. A couple of guys nodded as they walked past, like it was just another day. I even saw one man lean against my trailer as he stretched, his hand right on top of one of the larger symbols. But he didn't react at all. That's when it hit me. They couldn't see them. Whatever these markings were, whatever had put them there, they were meant for me alone. I knew I should call someone. My dispatcher, the police, hell, even the local news. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what if talking about it made things worse? I had a terrible feeling that acknowledging these symbols out loud might give them some kind of power. So I did the only thing I could think of. I got back in the truck and I drove. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every time I looked at my truck, the symbols were there, constantly shifting and changing. Sometimes they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Other times they looked like they were carved deep into the metal, leaving shadows that didn't match the angle of the sun. I avoided truck stops and populated rest areas, terrified that someone might eventually notice. Instead, I pulled over on lonely stretches of highway or deserted back roads when I needed to rest. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The worst part was the whispering. It started on the second night, just on the edge of hearing, a constant low murmur that seemed to come from the markings themselves. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, hungry, insistent, almost pleading. By the time I reached Seattle, I was a wreck. I hadn't showered, hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. My hands shook as I handed over the paperwork at the delivery depot. The guy at the receiving dock gave me a strange look but didn't say anything. I wondered if I looked as bad as I felt. As soon as the trailer was unloaded, I booked it to the nearest truck wash. I spent 3 hours there, scrubbing every inch of my rig. The symbols disappeared under the soap and water, but I knew they weren't really gone. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, lurking just beneath the paint. I thought about quitting, about walking away from trucking altogether. But this job is all I know, and the road is in my blood. So I keep driving, but things are different now. I avoid driving at night when I can. I keep my eyes straight ahead, afraid to look too closely at my own truck. And I never, ever sleep in rest areas anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of the job finally got to me. Maybe I had some kind of breakdown. But then I'll feel that electric tingle on my fingertips or catch a whisper of that otherworldly murmuring, and I know it was real. I don't know what those symbols meant. I don't know why they appeared on my truck or why only I could see them, but I do know this. There are things out there on the dark highways that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the reach of our headlights, waiting for a chance to break through. So the next time you're driving late at night and you pass a truck on some lonely stretch of road, take a good look at it. And if you see something strange, something that doesn't quite make sense, do yourself a favor and keep on driving. Don't slow down, don't look back. Because once you've seen them, the symbols never really go away. They're always there, watching, waiting, whispering. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I should have been relieved. I'd made it through another night. Instead, my stomach churned with dread. I knew what was coming. As the sun climbed higher, my rig rumbled to life, the engine purring as if nothing had ever been wrong. But I knew better. I'd been living this nightmare for weeks now, trapped in a cycle I couldn't explain and couldn't escape. My truck, my livelihood, my home away from home had become my prison. Every night, as darkness fell, it would die. And nothing, not keys, not jumper cables, not even a full engine replacement could bring it back to life until the sun rose again. It all started about a month ago. I'd been driving for long-haul logistics for the better part of a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. Freak storms, midnight breakdowns, cargo thieves, you name it, I'd handled it. But nothing could have prepared me for this. I was on a routine run from Atlanta to Los Angeles, hauling a load of home appliances. It was a milk run, the kind of job I could do in my sleep. The first couple of days went smooth as silk. I was making good time, the weather was cooperating, and I was looking forward to spending a few days off in LA before heading back east. As I crossed into New Mexico, the sun was setting, painting the desert landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how lucky I was to have a job that let me see sights like this. If only I'd known what was coming. I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Albuquerque, planning to grab some dinner and catch a few hours of shut-eye before pushing on through the night. I filled up the tank, parked in one of the overnight spots, and headed inside for some much-needed coffee and a plate of greasy diner food. When I came back out, belly full and thermos topped off, I climbed into the cab and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. I figured it was just a fluke. Maybe the battery connection had come loose on that rough stretch of road back in Texas. I popped the hood, checked the connections, and tried again. Still nothing. I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine. I spent the next hour checking everything I could think of: battery, alternator, starter motor. Hell, I even crawled underneath to make sure no local critters had made a snack of my wiring. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing just wouldn't start. By this point, it was fully dark. The lot was bathed in the harsh glow of sodium lights, and a chill had settled over the desert. I was starting to worry. I had a delivery deadline to meet, and this unexpected delay was eating into my driving time. I called roadside assistance, resigning myself to a long wait and an expensive repair bill. The mechanic showed up about an hour later. He was a grizzled old guy named Earl, with hands like catcher's mitts and a perpetual squint. He went through the same checks I had, then a bunch more I didn't even know about. After about 45 minutes, he stepped back, scratching his head. "Well, son," he drawled, "I've been fixing trucks for nigh on 40 years, and I've never seen nothing like this. By all rights, this rig should be purring like a kitten, but it's dead as a doornail." He suggested we try a jump start, even though the battery checked out fine. We hooked up the cables, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I heard the engine turn over. But it was just the wind playing tricks on us. Earl shook his head, muttered something about damn computers messing up good engines, and said he'd have to tow it to his shop for a more thorough diagnosis. I was about to agree when the first light of dawn started to creep over the eastern horizon. Suddenly, without warning or reason, my truck roared to life. The engine sounded perfect, like it had just rolled off the assembly line. Earl and I stared at each other, dumbfounded. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, voicing what we were both thinking. I chalked it up to one of those weird flukes that sometimes happen with machines. I thanked Earl for his time, paid him for the service call, and hit the road, determined to make up for lost time. But as the sun set that evening, it happened again. One minute I was cruising down I-40, the next my truck was coasting to a stop on the shoulder, every electrical system dead. This time I didn't even bother trying to fix it. I just sat there watching the last light fade from the sky, a sick feeling growing in my gut. Sure enough, as soon as the sun peeked over the horizon the next morning, the engine came back to life like nothing had ever been wrong. This pattern repeated itself night after night. During the day, my truck ran perfectly. But as soon as darkness fell, it would die, only to resurrect itself at dawn. I tried everything I could think of. I had the entire electrical system replaced. I even went so far as to have the engine swapped out for a brand new one. Nothing made a difference. I couldn't explain it to my dispatcher. How do you tell someone that your truck is, what, cursed? Allergic to darkness? I made up excuses, mechanical troubles, food poisoning, anything I could think of to explain why I was suddenly only driving during daylight hours. But I knew it was just a matter of time before I lost my job. The worst part was the waiting. Those long, dark hours between sunset and sunrise, sitting in my cab, unable to sleep, jumping at every sound. Sometimes I'd hear things moving in the darkness outside, scraping sounds like something circling my truck. Other times I could have sworn I heard whispering, unintelligible words in a language I didn't recognize. I started sleeping during the day and driving from sunrise to sunset. It wasn't ideal. The roads were more crowded and I was missing out on the cooler night temperatures. But it was the only way I could keep moving. I became obsessed with the weather forecast, always knowing exactly when sunrise and sunset would be, planning my trips meticulously to ensure I was somewhere safe when darkness fell. But you can't outrun the night forever. About a week ago, I was pushing hard to make a delivery, trying to reach a safe stopping point before sundown. I miscalculated. The sun dipped below the horizon when I was still 20 miles from the nearest town. I felt the truck shudder, the familiar sensation of all systems going dark. I coasted as far as I could, finally coming to rest on the shoulder of a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. As darkness settled around me, the noises started, scratching sounds on the sides of the trailer, tapping on the windows of the cab, and that damned whispering, louder than ever. I huddled in my sleeper berth, a tire iron clutched in my sweaty hands, counting the seconds until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I was a mess. My hands shook so bad I could barely steer. I made it to the next truck stop and called my dispatcher. I told her I quit. I couldn't do this anymore. But here's the thing. I don't know how to do anything else. Trucking is my life. It's in my blood. My old man was a trucker and his old man before him. The thought of walking away from it all, it terrifies me almost as much as another night alone in the dark. So I'm still here, still driving, but only during the day. I've got a solar charger rigged up to keep my phone alive during those long nights, and I've taken to carrying a handheld CB radio as a backup. I've loaded my tablet with books, movies, anything to keep my mind occupied while I wait for the sun. I don't know why this is happening to me. I don't know if it will ever end. All I know is that every evening as the sun sinks lower in the sky, I feel that familiar knot of dread forming in my stomach. And every morning as my truck rumbles back to life with the dawn, I say a silent prayer of thanks. To all you night owls out there, the long haulers who prefer the empty roads and cool air of midnight runs, cherish it. There's a freedom in driving through the darkness that I never appreciated until it was taken from me. And to those of you who pass a lone truck parked on the shoulder in the middle of the night, give us a wide berth. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the sun to set. The first time I saw the handprint, I thought I was losing my mind. It was there on the passenger side door of my rig, clear as day, a perfect impression of a child's hand, small and delicate, pressed into the layer of road grime that covered the truck. But that was impossible. I'd been driving nonstop for the past 12 hours through the kind of desolate stretch of highway where you can go hours without seeing another soul. There was no way a kid could have touched my truck. And yet, there it was, undeniable proof that something wasn't right. I've been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last summer. It was the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, about reality itself. Even now, months later, I break out in a cold sweat just thinking about it. It all started on a run from Phoenix to Seattle. It was the height of summer, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt and turns your cab into an oven the moment you cut the AC. I'd been on the road for about 6 hours, the monotony of the desert landscape broken only by the occasional gas station or rundown diner. I first noticed the handprint just outside of Las Vegas. I'd pulled over at a rest stop to stretch my legs and grab a coffee from the thermos in my cab. That's when I saw it. A tiny handprint on the passenger door, right at the height a small child might reach if they were standing next to the truck. At first, I thought it must have been there from my last stop, maybe some kid horsing around while their parents weren't looking. But I distinctly remembered wiping down the doors at my last fuel stop, trying to get rid of some of the dust and bug splatter. This print was fresh, pressed into a new layer of road grime that had accumulated over the past few hours. I stood there for a good 5 minutes just staring at that handprint. A chill ran down my spine despite the desert heat. Something about it felt off. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow to be quite human. And there was something about the way it was pressed into the dirt, like whatever had made it had been pushing to get in, not just touching the surface. I shook my head, told myself I was being ridiculous. The long hours and the monotony of the road were clearly getting to me. I wiped away the handprint with a rag, got back in the cab and hit the road, determined to put the whole thing out of my mind. But it wasn't that easy. As the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I kept glancing at my side mirrors, half expecting to see something clinging to the side of my trailer. The CB radio, usually a constant chatter of road updates and trucker banter, was eerily silent. As night fell, the unease grew into full-blown anxiety. The headlights of oncoming traffic were few and far between, each set feeling like a brief respite from the pressing darkness. I found myself hunching over the wheel, eyes straining to pierce the gloom beyond the reach of my high beams. I was about an hour outside of Reno when I saw it. Another handprint, this time on the inside of my windshield. My heart nearly stopped. I knew for a fact that it hadn't been there a moment ago. I'd been staring at that windshield for hours, and there was no way I would have missed it. I pulled over, my hands shaking so bad I could barely manage the gear shift. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, staring at that small, perfect handprint on the glass. It looked like it had been made from the inside, like a child had pressed their hand against the windshield while sitting in the passenger seat. But that was impossible. I was alone in the cab. I'm always alone in the cab. I reached out, my own hand shaking to touch the print. The moment my fingers made contact with the glass, the handprint vanished like it had never been there at all. But I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't crazy. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I thought about calling it quits, turning around and heading back to Phoenix. But I had a deadline to meet, and in this business, your reputation is everything. Missing a delivery because you got spooked by some mysterious handprints? I'd never live it down. So I kept driving. But now, every few hours, I'd spot a new handprint. On the mirrors, on the windows, on the trailer doors when I stopped to check my load. Always in places that should have been impossible for anyone to reach while I was moving. Always vanishing the moment I tried to touch them or show them to someone else. By the time I crossed into Oregon, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, jumping at every shadow, flinching at every unexpected sound. The handprints were appearing more frequently now, sometimes accompanied by strange scratching noises from the roof of my cab or the walls of the trailer. I finally broke down and called my dispatcher, trying to explain what was happening without sounding like I'd lost my mind. She was understanding, told me to pull over at the next truck stop and get some rest. Said she'd send someone out to take over the delivery if I wasn't feeling up to it in the morning. I found a truck stop about an hour later, pulled in and shut off the engine. The silence was deafening after so many hours of road noise. I sat there for a long time, afraid to look around, afraid of what I might see. When I finally worked up the courage to do a walk-around, my blood ran cold. The entire truck was covered in handprints, hundreds of them, maybe thousands of all different sizes. Some looked like they belonged to children, others to adults. A few were so large they could only have been made by something that wasn't human at all. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening, it wasn't possible. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, sure that when I opened them again, everything would be back to normal. I was wrong. When I looked again, the handprints were still there, but now they were moving, sliding across the surface of the truck, leaving trails in the grime like snail tracks. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as they converged on the cab doors. That's when I heard it. A sound like dozens of small hands tapping on metal coming from inside the trailer. I ran. I didn't care about my cargo, didn't care about my job. I just ran, keys still in the ignition, across the parking lot and into the truck stop. I must have looked like a madman bursting through those doors, wild-eyed and babbling about handprints and things in my trailer. The girl behind the counter called the cops. I didn't blame her. I probably would have done the same in her position. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No handprints, no scratches, no evidence of anything unusual. My truck was exactly as it should be, my cargo untouched. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a touch of heat stroke. Told me to get some rest and be more careful about my driving hours in the future. I quit trucking after that. Couldn't bring myself to get behind the wheel again, not after what I'd seen. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of small hands tapping on metal echoing in my ears. I don't know what happened out there on that lonely stretch of highway. I don't know if it was all in my head, some kind of mental breakdown brought on by too many hours alone on the road, or if there really is something out there, something that leaves impossible handprints and follows solitary trucks through the night. All I know is this: the next time you're driving late at night and you pass a big rig on some deserted highway, take a good look at it. And if you see something strange, something that doesn't quite make sense, handprints where there shouldn't be any, shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't move, do yourself a favor and keep on driving. Don't slow down, don't look too closely. Because once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. And you never know when those small, impossible hands might reach for you next. They say lightning never strikes twice in the same place. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a load of bull. In fact, I've seen it strike the same spot over and over again. My spot, my truck. Every damn time there's a storm, it's like I'm driving a giant lightning rod down the highway. And let me tell you, it's not the kind of adrenaline rush any trucker signs up for. It all started about 6 months ago on a run from Miami to Chicago. I'd been driving for Thunderbolt Logistics. Yeah, I know, the irony isn't lost on me, for the better part of a decade. Long hauls were my bread and butter, and I prided myself on always delivering on time, come hell or high water. Little did I know I was about to experience a little bit of both. The first couple days of the trip were smooth sailing. Clear skies, open roads, the kind of driving that reminds you why you fell in love with trucking in the first place. I was making good time, even thinking I might be able to squeeze in a little R&R in the Windy City before heading back south. I was just outside of Atlanta when the weather started to turn. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and the radio crackled with warnings of severe thunderstorms. Now I've driven through my fair share of bad weather blizzards in the Rockies, dust storms in Arizona, you name it. A little thunder and lightning didn't scare me, at least not then. The rain started coming down in sheets about an hour later. I slowed down, keeping a firm grip on the wheel as the wind buffeted my rig. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Standard stuff, nothing I hadn't handled 100 times before. Then it happened. A bolt of lightning, bright enough to leave spots dancing in my vision, struck the road about 50 yards ahead of me. I let out a low whistle, thinking about how close that was. Little did I know it was just the opening act. Not 5 minutes later, another bolt hit. This time it couldn't have been more than 20 feet in front of my truck. I felt the heat of it through my windshield, smelled the sharp scent of ozone. My heart was pounding now, hands slick with sweat on the wheel. I was looking for the next exit, thinking maybe I should wait out the storm, when the third strike came. This one hit my rig directly. There was a blinding flash, a deafening crack, and suddenly every electronic system in my truck went haywire. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The radio screamed static, and for one heart-stopping moment I thought I was going to lose control. Somehow I managed to wrestle the truck onto the shoulder. I sat there, engine idling, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. 3 lightning strikes in less than 10 minutes, each one closer than the last, culminating in a direct hit. The odds were astronomical. I called my dispatcher, explaining the situation and saying I needed to wait out the storm. She agreed, telling me to stay safe and keep her updated. I settled in, watching the storm rage around me, flinching at every flash of lightning. As suddenly as it had started, the storm passed. The rain tapered off, the clouds parted, and soon I was bathed in late afternoon sunlight. I did a quick walk around, half expecting to see scorch marks or melted metal. But my truck looked fine. A little worse for wear from the rain, but no signs of a lightning strike. Shaken but relieved, I pulled back onto the highway. I told myself it was a freak occurrence, the kind of story you tell over beers that no one quite believes. If only I'd known it was just the beginning. Over the next few months, it happened again and again. Every time I drove through a storm, my truck would get hit by lightning, sometimes once, sometimes multiple times. It didn't matter if I was in the middle of a pack of vehicles or alone on the road. The lightning always found me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was something about the metal composition of my truck that attracted electricity. Maybe it was the cargo I was hauling. I even had the company mechanics go over every inch of my rig, looking for anything unusual. They found nothing. I started obsessively checking weather reports before each run, trying to plan routes that would avoid storms. But you can't outrun the weather forever, especially not when you're crossing half the country on a regular basis. The strikes were taking their toll on my truck, too. I was going through electrical systems like they were disposable, replacing fried components after almost every run. The company was starting to ask questions, wondering why my maintenance costs were through the roof. But the real toll was on me. I couldn't sleep during storms anymore, even when I wasn't on the road. Every rumble of thunder had me breaking out in a cold sweat. I started seeing a therapist, trying to work through the anxiety that was consuming my life. She suggested it might be some form of PTSD, but how do you treat a fear that's justified every time you get behind the wheel? It all came to a head about a month ago. I was on a run from Dallas to New York, skirting the edge of a storm system that had been dogging me for hours. I was strung out, running on too much coffee and too little sleep, but determined to outpace the dark clouds on my tail. I should have known better. Should have pulled over and waited it out. But I was sick of feeling afraid, sick of letting the lightning dictate my life. So I kept driving, even as the first drops of rain hit my windshield. The strike, when it came, was the worst yet. It hit the top of my cab with a sound like the world splitting open. Every electronic system fried instantly. The engine died, leaving me coasting in a suddenly silent world. But this time something was different. As my truck rolled to a stop, I noticed a strange blue-white glow emanating from the hood. It pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter with each throb. The air around me felt charged, making the hair on my arms stand on end. Without thinking, I threw open the door and jumped out, my boots barely hitting the asphalt before another bolt struck. This one hit the spot I'd been sitting just seconds before. The entire cab lit up from the inside like some kind of otherworldly X-ray. I scrambled away, rain pelting my face, watching in horrified fascination as bolt after bolt hammered my truck. It was like the sky had a vendetta, determined to reduce my rig to a smoking husk. I don't know how long it went on. It could have been minutes or hours. I just stood there, drenched to the bone, as nature unleashed its fury on the machine that had been my home away from home for years. When it was over, when the last echoes of thunder had faded and the rain had slowed to a drizzle, I approached my truck with shaking legs. The once familiar shape was barely recognizable. The metal was warped and twisted, still glowing in places with residual heat. The tires had melted into the asphalt, and there was a hole clean through the trailer where a particularly vicious bolt had struck. But the strangest thing, the thing that still haunts my dreams, was what I found inside the cab. There, etched into the melted remains of my dashboard, was a pattern. At first I thought it was just random damage, the chaotic result of all that electrical discharge. But as I looked closer, I realized it was deliberate, intentional. It looked like writing, but in no language I'd ever seen. Curves and angles that hurt my eyes to look at directly, that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't focusing on them. I backed away, my mind reeling. This wasn't just some freak electrical phenomenon. This was something else, something I couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize away. I quit trucking that day. Walked away from the job I'd loved for over a decade. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the smell of ozone in my nostrils, the image of that unearthly writing burned into my mind. I don't know why the lightning chose me. I don't know what that message was or who or what it was from. All I know is that every time I hear thunder now, a part of me wants to run and hide. And another part wonders if it's trying to tell me something. If maybe, just maybe, I should have stayed to listen. So the next time you're driving through a storm and you see a truck pulled over on the side of the road, give it a wide berth. It might just be a driver waiting out the weather, or it might be someone like me, someone who's learned the hard way that sometimes the lightning does strike twice, and when it does, it might have something to say. I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and I've seen some strange things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw that night in the mountains of Colorado. Tire tracks don't just appear out of nowhere, leading off the edge of a cliff, and they sure as hell don't disappear into thin air. But that's exactly what I saw, and it's a sight that still haunts me to this day. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the stars seem close enough to touch. I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Salt Lake City, a route I'd driven more times than I could count. The winding mountain roads were like an old friend by now, each curve and switchback as familiar as the back of my hand. I'd left Denver later than usual, thanks to some loading dock drama that had eaten up half my day. But I wasn't worried. The roads were clear, the sky was cloudless, and I had a thermos full of coffee to keep me company. I figured I'd make up the lost time on the overnight haul. About 3 hours into the drive, I was deep in the heart of the Rockies. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional glimmer of reflective eyes from the forest alongside the road. The radio was playing some old country tune, and I was humming along, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a tree or a rock formation. But as I got closer, I realized what I was seeing. A set of fresh tire tracks veering off the road and heading straight for the guardrail. My heart rate kicked up a notch. In these mountains, a vehicle going off the road usually meant one thing, and it wasn't good. I slowed down, looking for any signs of a recent accident. Broken glass, twisted metal, anything that would indicate a vehicle had gone over the edge. But there was nothing. Just those tracks, dark and clear against the pale asphalt, leading right up to the guardrail. And then, nothing. No broken guardrail, no disturbed gravel on the other side. It was like the vehicle that made those tracks had simply vanished into thin air. I pulled over, my hazard lights blinking in the darkness. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I'd been on the road too long. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed down from the cab. The night air was cold enough to make me shiver and unnaturally still. No wind, no distant rumble of traffic. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. I walked over to where the tracks began, my boots crunching on loose gravel. Up close, they were even more baffling. They started abruptly, as if a vehicle had materialized out of nowhere right in the middle of my lane. The tread pattern was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not quite a car, not quite a truck. Something different. I followed the tracks to the guardrail, my flashlight beam dancing over the asphalt. They led straight to the metal barrier and then stopped. I leaned over the rail, half expecting to see a wreck at the bottom of the ravine, but there was nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of treetops far below. That's when I noticed something else. The guardrail wasn't damaged, not even scratched. Whatever had made these tracks hadn't crashed through. It was like it had passed right through the metal, or maybe over it, without leaving a trace. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard it. A low hum, almost below the threshold of hearing. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I swung my flashlight around looking for the source, but the beam just illuminated empty road and silent forest. The hum grew louder, and with it came a strange, shimmering quality to the air. It was like looking through heat waves on a hot summer day, but it was near freezing out here. The distortion seemed to center on a spot just beyond the guardrail, right where the tracks ended. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the shimmer intensified. The hum became a whine, then a piercing shriek that set my teeth on edge. I should have run, should have gotten back in my truck and driven away as fast as I could. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape against the starry sky. But as it got closer, details began to emerge. It wasn't a car or a truck or any kind of vehicle I'd ever seen. It was something else, something impossible. It looked like a cross between a semi and a spacecraft, all sleek lines and glowing panels. It had wheels, but they weren't touching the ground. The thing was floating, hovering just above the road surface. As it approached, I could see inside the cab. The driver, if you could call it that, wasn't human. Its body was vaguely humanoid, but its head was too large, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. And its eyes... God, its eyes. They locked onto mine, and in that moment I felt like my entire life was being pulled apart and examined. The vehicle, the craft, whatever it was, passed right through the guardrail like it wasn't even there. It settled onto the road with a soft hiss, its wheels making contact with the asphalt and leaving those impossible tracks. I stood there paralyzed as it rolled past me. The driver never took its eyes off me, its gaze burning into my soul. As it passed, I felt a wave of something. Not quite emotion, not quite thought. More like pure information, downloaded directly into my brain. In an instant, I saw glimpses of other worlds, other realities. I saw versions of Earth where history had taken radically different turns. I saw spacecraft plying the spaces between stars, carrying cargo just like I did, but on a cosmic scale. And I saw myself, or versions of myself, driving trucks on roads that spanned galaxies. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The shimmering air, the unearthly hum, the impossible vehicle, all of it vanished, leaving me alone on a dark mountain road with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I stood there trying to process what I'd seen. Minutes, hours. Eventually, the cold and the reality of my situation seeped back in. I had a delivery to make. I had a job to do. On shaky legs, I made my way back to my truck. I climbed into the cab, my sanctuary, my home away from home, but it didn't feel safe anymore. Nothing felt safe or certain. I managed to complete my delivery. Somehow I kept driving in the days and weeks that followed. But things were different. I was different. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself scanning the sky, watching for shimmering air and impossible vehicles. I never saw it again, never saw anything like it. But I know what I saw that night. And I know those tracks were real, even if they defied every law of physics I thought I knew. Sometimes, on long hauls through lonely stretches of nowhere, I find myself hoping I'll see it again. That I'll get another glimpse of those other worlds, those cosmic highways. Other times, the memory of those alien eyes makes me want to park my rig and never drive again. But I keep driving because that's what truckers do. We keep moving, keep delivering, no matter what strange things we see on the road. And let me tell you, the roads out there are stranger than most people could ever imagine. So the next time you're driving late at night and you see a set of tracks leading off into nowhere, or a shimmer in the air that shouldn't be there, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look too closely. Because once you've seen what's really out there on the highways of this world and others, you can never unsee it. And trust me, there are some things we're just not meant to understand. The silence hit me like a physical blow. One moment, the cab of my rig was filled with the familiar chatter of the CB radio and the twang of some country song on the FM dial. The next, nothing. Dead air. Not static, not interference, just absence. It was like someone had pulled a plug on the entire world, leaving me alone in a bubble of eerie quiet. Little did I know that silence was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change everything I thought I knew about the open road. I've been hauling freight across the lower 48 for the better part of 2 decades. Name a highway and chances are I've driven it, probably more times than I can count. I thought I'd seen it all. Freak storms, midnight breakdowns, cargo thieves, you name it. But nothing in all my years behind the wheel could have prepared me for what happened on that lonely stretch of Nevada desert. It was a run-of-the-mill job, moving electronics from San Francisco to Denver. The kind of gig I could do in my sleep. I'd left the Bay Area just after sundown, figuring I'd make good time through the night when traffic was light. The first few hours went smooth as silk. The big rig was humming along, eating up the miles like nobody's business. I just crossed the Nevada state line when things started to get weird. It was subtle at first. The radio stations began to fade in and out, more static than signal. I didn't think much of it. After all, radio reception can be spotty out in these parts. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station, but it was like trying to tune in a ghost. That's when the CB went silent. Now that got my attention real quick. The CB is a trucker's lifeline, our connection to other drivers and the outside world. It's never quiet, not completely. There's always someone out there chattering away about road conditions or speed traps or just shooting the breeze to pass the time. But now, nothing. Not a peep. I keyed the mic, gave the usual breaker 1 to 9 inches call. No response. I tried again, this time with a general call for any ears out there. Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I glanced at my phone, thinking I'd call my dispatcher, let her know about the radio silence. But the screen was dark, dead. I knew for a fact I'd charged it at my last stop, but now it was like someone had sucked all the juice right out of it. That's when I noticed the lights, or rather the lack of them. I was on a straight stretch of highway, the kind where you can see for miles. There should have been pinpricks of light in the distance, other vehicles, far-off towns, but there was nothing, just an inky blackness beyond the reach of my headlights. I eased off the accelerator, my palms sweating on the wheel. The quiet was oppressive now, pressing in on me from all sides. The only sound was the rumble of my engine and the hum of tires on asphalt. It felt like I was the last person left in the world. I'd been driving for about an hour in this unsettling silence when I saw it. A flicker of light in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind desperate for any sign of normalcy. But no, there it was again. A flash of white light, like someone turning on a powerful flashlight for just a split second. Relief washed over me. Another vehicle. I wasn't alone out here after all. I watched the mirror, waiting for headlights to appear. But they never did. Just that strange, flickering light, sometimes bright enough to illuminate the entire road behind me. Sometimes so faint I thought I'd imagined it. And it was getting closer. I pushed down on the accelerator, the big diesel engine roaring in protest. Whatever that light was, every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from it. The speedometer crept up 70, 80, 90 miles per hour, faster than I'd ever pushed this rig before. But every time I checked the mirror, that light was still there, still gaining. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat trickled down my back. I was going nearly 100 miles an hour now, the truck swaying dangerously. But I didn't dare slow down, because now I could see something in that light, a shape. Something that didn't belong on any highway I'd ever driven. It was big, whatever it was, bigger than my truck, and it moved in a way that nothing on wheels should be able to move. Fluid, predatory, like a shark cutting through water. I was so focused on the mirror that I almost missed the turn. A sign flashed by. Rest area 1 mile. I made a split-second decision. Maybe I could lose it if I got off the main road. I took the exit ramp way too fast, the truck tilting alarmingly. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to flip. But somehow I kept it under control, fishtailing into the rest area parking lot. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest. The truck shuddered to a halt and I killed the engine. Then I just sat there, hands clenched on the wheel, listening to the tick of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. The silence was back. No flickering light in my mirrors. No strange shape bearing down on me. Just the empty rest area, dimly lit by a few flickering sodium lamps. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart and make sense of what had just happened. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Finally, I worked up the courage to step out of the cab. The night air was cool on my sweat-soaked skin. I did a quick walk around, half expecting to see scorch marks or some other evidence of my wild ride, but the truck looked fine. No damage, no signs of anything unusual. That's when I saw the other trucks. 3 of them, parked in a neat row at the far end of the lot. I hadn't noticed them when I pulled in, too focused on escaping whatever was chasing me. A wave of relief washed over me. Other drivers. People I could talk to who might be able to shed some light on what the hell was going on. I jogged over, already calling out a greeting. But as I got closer, my steps slowed. Something was off. The trucks were pristine, like they'd just rolled off the factory floor. No road grime, no bug splatter. And they were old models, the kind you might see in a trucking museum, not on an active highway. I peered into the cab of the nearest rig. Empty. They all were. But they looked lived in. Thermoses of coffee on the dash, dog-eared paperbacks on the seats. It was like the drivers had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. That's when I saw the date on a newspaper lying on one of the seats. June 17th, 1976, nearly 50 years ago. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. I turned to run back to my truck to get the hell out of this place. And that's when I saw it. The shape from the highway. Up close, it was even more impossible. It looked like someone had taken parts from a dozen different vehicles and melded them together into something that should not be able to move, let alone chase down a speeding truck. It was all angles and curves that hurt my eyes to look at directly, glowing with that same flickering light I'd seen in my mirror, and it was blocking my path back to my rig. I stood there, frozen, as a section of the thing opened up. Not a door, not really. More like the whole front of it just rearranged itself. And from inside came a voice. Not a sound exactly. More like words appearing directly in my mind. "You've strayed from your route, driver. This sector is not for your kind. Return to your designated path." I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from what had to be some kind of crazy nightmare. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. "Your vehicle will be adjusted. Your memory corrected. Continue your delivery. Do not deviate again." There was a flash of light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, and then I woke up in my truck, parked at a rest stop just outside of Denver. My logbook showed I'd made the drive from San Francisco in record time with no stops. My delivery was on schedule. Everything was normal, except it wasn't, because I remembered. Not all of it, not clearly, but enough to know that something had happened out there in the Nevada desert, something that shouldn't have been possible. I've been driving these highways for 20 years, but now every time I get behind the wheel, I find myself watching, listening, wondering what's really out there in the spaces between cities, in the stretches of road where the radio goes quiet and the lights of civilization fade away. And I wonder, how many other drivers have strayed from their routes? How many have seen things they weren't supposed to see, only to have their memories corrected? How many of us are really in control of our own journeys? So the next time you're out on the open road and you hit a patch where your radio goes silent and your phone loses signal, pay attention. And if you see a flickering light in your rearview mirror, whatever you do, don't leave the highway. Some detours are better left untaken. The CB crackled to life, breaking the monotony of my overnight haul. "Any drivers near Widow's Peak? Got a situation here." The desperation in the voice sent a chill down my spine, colder than the Montana wind howling outside my rig. I keyed the mic. Yeah, I'm about 20 miles out. What's the situation? Static. Then, something's out here, man. I don't know what it is, but it ain't natural. Glowing eyes. If anyone's close, I could use some backup. I'd heard stories about Widow's Peak. Hell, every trucker who'd run the I-15 corridor had. Whispers of things that shouldn't exist, lurking in the shadows of the jagged cliffs. But that's all they were. Stories, right? Hang tight, buddy. I'm on my way, I replied, my foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Bare trees clawed at the night, their branches like bony fingers reaching for my truck as I sped past. The road twisted and turned, a black ribbon cutting through the wilderness. As I approached Widow's Peak, a sense of unease settled in my gut. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was trying to push me back. I flicked on my high beams, cutting through the darkness ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, unnaturally tall and thin. For a split second, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the gnarled trees. But then it turned. 2 pinpricks of light, a sickly yellowish green, pierced through the night. They were eyes, but not like any I'd ever seen. They seemed to pulse with an inner light, hypnotic and terrifying. I slammed on the brakes, the truck's tires screeching in protest. The figure didn't move. It just watched. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the CB. I see it, I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might draw its attention. The thing with the glowing eyes, where are you? No response, just static. I looked back at the road and my blood ran cold. The figure was gone. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I scanned the area. Nothing but darkness and the lonely stretch of highway. Had I imagined it? The stress of the long haul playing tricks on my mind? A tap on my driver's side window nearly made me jump out of my skin. I whipped my head around, expecting to see those haunting eyes inches from my face. Instead, I saw another trucker. He was pale, shaken, but unmistakably human. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and rolled down the window. "You the one who called for backup?" I asked. He nodded, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Yeah, that was me. Name's Mike. My rig's about a quarter-mile back. Engine just died on me." I introduced myself and offered him a ride to the nearest town. As he climbed in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around or how his hands trembled as he buckled his seatbelt. "So what exactly did you see out there?" I asked as we pulled away. Mike was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been driving these roads for 30 years, seen all kinds of things, but this was different." He described how his truck had suddenly lost power as he was climbing the steep grade of Widow's Peak. At first, he thought it was just mechanical trouble, but then he saw movement in the trees lining the road. It was like the shadows themselves were alive, Mike said, his voice trembling. And then I saw the eyes. God, those eyes. They seemed to look right through me, you know? Like they could see every dark thought I'd ever had. I nodded, remembering the unsettling glow I'd witnessed earlier. I saw them too, right in the middle of the road. Mike's head snapped towards me, his eyes wide. "You saw it? On the road?" "Yeah, just a few minutes ago. Tall, skinny thing. Couldn't make out much besides those eyes." He slumped in his seat, running a shaky hand through his thinning hair. Christ, I thought maybe I was going crazy, seeing things that weren't there. We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic hum of the engine the only sound. The moon dipped behind a bank of clouds, plunging the landscape into deeper darkness. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes constantly scanning the road ahead and the tree line to either side. "You ever hear the legend of Widow's Peak?" Mike asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Just that it's supposed to be haunted or something." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Haunted. Yeah, I guess you could say that." He settled into his seat, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield. "Story goes, back in the 1800s, there was a young bride living in these parts. Her husband was a trapper, gone for months at a time. One winter, he didn't come back." Mike paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "They say she went mad with grief. Spent every night on that peak, watching, waiting for him to return. As the months passed, the waiting turned to anger. Anger turned to hatred. And that hatred, it changed her. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Changed her how? The stories vary, Mike said. Some say she became a vengeful spirit. Others claim she made a deal with something dark, something that promised to bring her husband back. But all the stories agree on one thing: her eyes. They say they glow with an unholy light, filled with all the pain and rage of a love lost to the wilderness. I wanted to dismiss it as just another campfire tale, the kind truckers tell to keep themselves awake on long hauls. But after what I'd seen, a movement caught my eye. Something darted across the road ahead, too quick to make out clearly. I hit the brakes, the truck's headlights illuminating. Nothing. The road was empty. "You see that?" I asked, my voice tighter than I'd like to admit. Mike nodded, his face ashen. Yeah, I did." We sat there for a moment, the engine idling, both of us straining to see into the impenetrable darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our ragged breathing. Then we heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl and my hair stand on end. It was like a wail, but not quite human. It started low, almost at the edge of hearing, then rose to a piercing shriek that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. "Go," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "Go, go, go!" I didn't need to be told twice. I stomped on the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a roar. The wail followed us, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Trees whipped past in a dark blur as I pushed the rig to its limits. Every curve in the road was a test of nerve and skill, the trailer swaying dangerously behind us. But I didn't dare slow down, not with that sound chasing us. Mike was mumbling something beside me, his eyes squeezed shut. It took me a moment to realize he was praying. A flash of movement in my side mirror caught my attention. For just an instant, I saw a figure running alongside the truck. But that was impossible. We had to be doing at least 80 miles an hour. I blinked and it was gone. But the wailing continued, growing louder with each passing second. "It's getting closer," Mike whimpered. The road ahead split into 2 lanes as we hit a long, steep descent. I knew this stretch well. It was the last big hill before the highway flattened out and ran straight for miles. As we crested the hill, my blood turned to ice. There, in the middle of both lanes, stood the figure I'd seen earlier. Its eyes blazed in the darkness, 2 points of sickly light that seemed to bore into my soul. Time seemed to slow. I had a split second to make a decision: swerve and risk rolling the truck, or plow straight through and pray it wasn't as solid as it looked. I chose option 2. I roared a challenge and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The truck responded with a bellow of its own, surging forward like an enraged bull. The figure didn't move. Those eyes just kept staring, growing larger in my vision as we barreled towards it. At the last possible moment, just as I was bracing for impact, it vanished. No puff of smoke, no flash of light. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Beside me, Mike's eyes were wide with shock and disbelief. We drove on in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. The wailing had stopped, replaced by the familiar rumble of the engine and the hiss of tires on asphalt. It wasn't until we saw the lights of the next town that we finally began to relax. As we pulled into a truck stop, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Mike and I sat there for a long moment, neither of us making a move to get out. Finally, he turned to me. "Thanks," he said simply, "for coming when I called. For everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. As Mike climbed out of the cab, he paused. "You know, some say she's still out there, the widow, waiting for her love to return. Or maybe she's found new prey to hunt." With that, he shut the door and walked away, soon lost among the other trucks and bleary-eyed drivers starting their day. I sat there for a while longer, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The horrors of the night seemed to fade in the warm light of day like a nightmare upon waking. But as I finally stepped down from my rig, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the shadow of Widow's Peak, a pair of glowing eyes were watching, waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I would never drive that stretch of road at night again. The first howl cut through the night like a knife, silencing the rumble of my rig's engine and freezing the blood in my veins. I'd driven this stretch of Highway 16 through Shadow Grove 100 times before, but never had I heard anything like that sound, primal, hungry, and unmistakably close. My hands tightened on the wheel as I peered into the darkness beyond my headlights. The fog was rolling in thick, transforming the familiar forest into a twisted landscape of half-seen shapes and lurking shadows. Another howl rose from the gloom, closer this time, and suddenly the cab of my truck felt a whole lot smaller. I'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, pushing to make my delivery deadline. The rational part of my brain said it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Coyotes maybe, or some poor dog that had gotten lost in the woods. But there was something in those howls that set my teeth on edge. Something that whispered of teeth and claws and things that had no business existing in this modern world. A sign loomed out of the fog. Shadow Grove 5 miles. Just 5 more miles of this godforsaken forest. Then I'd hit open country again. I could make it. I had to make it. The CB radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly swerved off the road. Any drivers on Highway 16 be advised. We've got reports of unusual activity in the Shadow Grove area. Proceed with caution. I grabbed the handset, my palms slick with sweat. This is Big Red, westbound on 16. I'm hearing some strange noises out here. Over. Static hissed for a long moment before the reply came. Roger that, Big Red. Can you describe what you're hearing? Over. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. There, in the middle of the road, not 50 yards ahead, stood something. The fog swirled around it, obscuring its shape, but I could make out a massive, shaggy form far larger than any animal had a right to be. And its eyes. God help me, its eyes glowed like embers in the gloom. I slammed on the brakes, the trailer fishtailing behind me as I fought to keep control. The thing in the road didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there watching as 18 wheels of steel and cargo bore down on it. At the last possible second, it leapt aside with impossible speed and grace. I caught a glimpse of fur and fang as it vanished into the tree line, and then I was past, heart hammering in my chest. The radio squawked again. Big Red, do you copy? What's your situation? Over. My hands shook as I raised the handset. I don't know what I just saw. Something big. Animal maybe, but wrong somehow. It was in the middle of the damn road. Roger that, Big Red. We've had similar reports. Advise you proceed to the nearest town and wait for daylight. Highway patrol is en route. Over. I wanted nothing more than to floor it and get the hell out of Shadow Grove. But the fog was thickening by the second, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond my hood. And somewhere out there, that thing was waiting. Another howl split the night, answered by another and another. The sound seemed to come from all around me, as if the entire forest had come alive with hungry voices. Negative on waiting for daylight, I radioed back. I'm pushing through to Clear Creek. Should be there in 20 minutes if I don't run into any more trouble. Over. Understood, Big Red. Be careful out there. Over and out. I clicked off the radio and focused on the road ahead. The fog pressed in closer, tendrils of mist curling around my side mirrors. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, shapes that might have been trees or might have been something far worse. A flash of movement to my right. I turned just in time to see a dark form keeping pace with my truck, running through the underbrush with impossible speed. Another appeared on my left, then another. The howls grew louder, more frenzied. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. But no matter how fast I went, those shadowy shapes kept pace, flitting through the trees like smoke. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. They were campfire stories, urban legends whispered by bored truckers at rest stops. They weren't real, but the howls that echoed through Shadow Grove told a different story. A sharp turn loomed ahead, the yellow warning sign barely visible through the fog. I slowed, taking the curve as fast as I dared. As I did, one of the shapes burst from the tree line, racing straight for my cab. I caught a glimpse of slavering jaws, of eyes that glowed with an unholy hunger. Then it leapt, claws scrabbling against metal as it tried to find purchase on the side of my rig. I swerved hard, heart in my throat. The creature lost its grip and fell away, its howl of rage lost in the roar of my engine. But I knew it wasn't gone. None of them were gone. The road straightened out again, and I mashed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer crept past 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. Reckless, insane speeds for these twisting forest roads, but fear pushed all thoughts of caution from my mind. More shapes raced alongside me, their howls rising to a fever pitch. I could hear claws scraping against the trailer, thumps and bangs as they hurled themselves at my rig. The cab shuddered with each impact, and I found myself wondering just how much abuse the old girl could take before something gave way. A signpost flashed by. Clear Creek 2 miles, just 2 more miles. I could make it. I had to make it. The howls changed then, becoming something almost like words, a chant rising and falling with a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. I couldn't make out what they were saying, didn't want to make out what they were saying, but the sound wormed its way into my brain, making it hard to focus on the road ahead. 1 mile to go. The fog was thinning now, the trees beginning to thin out. I could see stars peeking through gaps in the canopy above. Just a little further. A massive form burst from the undergrowth directly in front of me. I had a split-second glimpse of matted fur, of eyes like burning coals, of teeth that gleamed in the glow of my headlights. Then I was on it, 18 wheels and 40 tons of steel and cargo slamming into it at over 100 miles an hour. The impact rocked my rig, nearly sending me off the road. I fought the wheel, tires screaming as I struggled to keep control. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to jackknife. Then I was through, the trees falling away as I burst out of Shadow Grove and onto the open plain beyond. The howls faded behind me, replaced by the blessed sound of my engine and the hum of tires on asphalt. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of Clear Creek in the distance. Only then did I ease off the accelerator, my hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. As I pulled into the truck stop on the outskirts of town, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, embedded in the front grille of my truck, was a tuft of coarse, dark fur. I stumbled from the cab on shaky legs, fumbling for my phone. I had to call someone, had to report what had happened, but as I dialed, a thought stopped me cold. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believed it myself, and I'd lived through it. The sun was just peeking over the horizon as I made my way into the truck stop diner. I ordered coffee, black as sin and hot enough to scald, and tried to make sense of what had happened in Shadow Grove. As I sat there, I overheard a conversation from the next booth over. 2 other drivers talking in low, worried tones. "You hear about Big Joe? He was supposed to come through Shadow Grove last night, never made it. Damn, that's the 3rd one this month. They're saying it's just accidents, bad weather and worse roads. But I don't know, man. Something ain't right in those woods." I closed my eyes, the memory of glowing eyes and unearthly howls fresh in my mind. They were right. Something wasn't right in Shadow Grove, and I had a feeling that as long as that forest stood, the howls would continue to echo through the night, calling to something deep and primal within us all. I drained my coffee and stood, decision made. I was done with long-haul trucking. Let someone else deal with the things that lurked in the shadows of America's highways. Me? I was going home. Back to the city where the only howls came from sirens and the monsters wore human faces. As I walked back to my rig, I paused, looking back towards the distant smudge of green that marked Shadow Grove. For a moment, I thought I heard something on the wind, a faint, familiar howl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Then it was gone, lost in the bustle of the truck stop and the light of day. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that when night fell again, the howling would return. And God help anyone caught in Shadow Grove when it did. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the empty highway. I'd been driving for hours, the monotonous drone of my rig's engine lulling me into a trance-like state. That's when I saw it, a shadow so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Fatigue could do that, especially on these long overnight hauls. But as I blinked and refocused, the shadow remained. No, not remained, it was moving. Flowing across the highway like some impossible tide of darkness. I eased my foot off the accelerator, my hands tightening on the wheel. In all my years of long-haul trucking, I'd never seen anything like this. The CB radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. It was just me, my rig, and whatever the hell that thing was up ahead. As I drew closer, the true scale of the phenomenon became clear. This wasn't just a shadow. It was as if a piece of the night itself had torn free and was now crawling across the earth. It moved with a fluid grace that defied explanation, undulating over the landscape like some vast, ethereal serpent. My headlights seemed to dim as I approached, the beams swallowed by the inky blackness. The temperature in the cab plummeted, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to floor it in the opposite direction. But a morbid curiosity kept my foot on the gas, inching me closer to the edge of that impossible darkness. The shadow's leading edge crept across the highway, and I felt a moment of panic. What if it wasn't just a visual phenomenon? What if driving into it meant driving into nothing? I eased onto the brakes, bringing my rig to a stop about 100 yards from where the shadow met the asphalt. For a long moment, I just sat there, engine idling, watching as the darkness flowed across the road. It moved with purpose, as if driven by some unseen force. And then, as the bulk of the shadow passed, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Silhouetted against the moonlit sky, rising above the tree line, was a shape. Massive beyond comprehension, it moved with the shadow. No, it was the shadow. I caught glimpses of a serpentine neck, of a head that could have swallowed my truck whole. Wings unfurled, blocking out the stars themselves. This was no trick of the light, no fatigue-induced hallucination. This was something ancient, something that had no place in our modern world of asphalt and diesel. As if sensing my gaze, the titanic shape paused. Slowly, with a grace that belied its impossible size, it turned. I found myself staring into eyes the size of billboards, glowing with an inner fire that spoke of age and power beyond human reckoning. Time seemed to stop. The world held its breath. In that moment, I felt the weight of eons pressing down on me. This thing, this creature, had walked the earth when our ancestors were still huddling in caves. It had seen empires rise and fall, had soared over mountains that now lay flat and smooth, and it was looking right at me. A sound filled the air, so low I felt it more than heard it. It thrummed through my bones, rattled my teeth in their sockets. The windows of my rig vibrated, threatening to shatter. In that sound, I heard the birth of stars and the death of galaxies. I don't know how long I sat there, transfixed by that ancient gaze. It could have been seconds or hours. But eventually, the creature turned away. With a movement that seemed to bend reality itself, it continued on its path, the shadow flowing with it. As it passed, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I gulped in air, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My hands shook as I fumbled for the CB radio. This is Big Al, westbound on Highway 47. I don't know how to explain what I just saw. Over. Static hissed for a long moment before a reply came. Big Al, this is dispatch. Can you clarify your situation? Over. I laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to the sound. How could I possibly explain what I just witnessed? I saw, Christ, I don't even know, a shadow, but it was alive, huge, like big enough to blot out the moon. And there was something in it, something ancient. Another long pause. When the dispatcher spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. Big Al, how long have you been on the road? Over. I glanced at the clock on my dash. About 14 hours, but I'm telling you, this wasn't fatigue, this was real. All right, Big Al, there's a rest stop about 10 miles ahead. Why don't you pull in there and get some sleep? We can discuss this when you're more rested. Over. I wanted to argue, to make her understand that this wasn't some hallucination brought on by too many hours behind the wheel. But I knew how it sounded. Hell, if someone had told me this story yesterday, I'd have thought they were nuts. Roger that, dispatch. I'll check in from the rest stop. Over and out. I set the handset down, my gaze drawn back to where the shadow had been. The highway stretched out empty and mundane, bathed in moonlight. No sign remained of the impossible thing I'd witnessed. With a shaky sigh, I put the rig in gear and started rolling again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me hoped that after some sleep, I'd realize it had all been a dream. But a deeper part knew the truth. I'd glimpsed something not meant for human eyes, something that existed in the liminal spaces between our world and somewhere else. As I drove, I found myself scanning the horizon, half expecting to see that vast shadow rise up again. But the night remained still and empty. I pulled into the rest stop about 15 minutes later, guiding my rig into one of the oversized spaces. As I shut off the engine, the sudden silence felt oppressive. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of the few other trucks parked for the night. Sleep seemed impossible after what I'd experienced, but fatigue was catching up with me. I climbed into the sleeper cab, my movements mechanical as I went through my nightly routine. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the memory of those ancient eyes, of the weight of that gaze. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. For a blissful moment, the events of the night before seemed like nothing more than a bad dream. Then I saw it, a single massive feather lying on the hood of my truck. It was easily the size of a surfboard, its surface shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and change as I looked at it. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage, but it remained solid and real as I reached out to touch it. The feather was warm, pulsing with an energy I could feel in my bones. As my fingers brushed its surface, a flood of images rushed through my mind. Vast primordial landscapes, skies filled with creatures that defied description, a world both familiar and utterly alien. I snatched my hand back, gasping. The feather remained, an impossible testament to the reality of what I'd witnessed. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't exactly file this in my logbook. Encountered ancient building-sized flying creature, obtained proof in form of magical feather. Yeah, that'd go over well. In the end, I did the only thing I could. I carefully wrapped the feather in a tarp and stowed it in my rig. Then I went about my day as if nothing had happened. I made my delivery, picked up a new load, and hit the road again. But things had changed. I found myself scanning the skies constantly, searching for a glimpse of that impossible shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those ancient, burning eyes staring back at me. I knew I'd witnessed something few humans ever had, a glimpse behind the curtain of reality. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more wondrous than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere out there, soaring between the stars or slumbering in some hidden valley, that ancient being continued its ageless existence. As the miles rolled by beneath my wheels, I made a decision. I'd keep driving, keep moving, because now I knew the truth. The greatest marvels and mysteries didn't lie at the end of the road. They were out here in the spaces between, waiting for those with eyes to see and the courage to look up. The shadow had changed me, had shown me a world beyond my wildest dreams. And while part of me feared what else might be lurking in the darkness, a greater part thrilled at the possibilities. So I'd keep driving, keep watching, and maybe, just maybe, I'd catch another glimpse of the impossible. After all, the night is vast, the road is long, and who knows what wonders or terrors await in the shadows between the stars. The first rule of long-haul trucking: never look too long in your rearview mirror. You focus on what's ahead, not what's behind. But as I cruised down that lonely stretch of Highway 9, something in that small rectangle of glass caught my eye. Something that shouldn't exist. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. 14 hours on the road will do that to a man. But as I squinted into the mirror, the shapes became clearer. Wolf-like creatures loping along the shoulder of the road, on two legs. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. When I looked again, they were closer. 5 of them moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. In the fading twilight, their eyes glowed with an unnatural amber light. My hands tightened on the wheel as a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't possible. Wolves didn't walk on 2 legs, and they sure as hell didn't keep pace with a semi doing 70 miles an hour. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed it harder. The speedometer crept up, 75, 80, 85. In the mirror, the creatures matched my speed effortlessly, their powerful legs eating up the asphalt. "This isn't happening," I muttered, reaching for the CB radio. "This is Big John, westbound on Highway 9. Anybody out there? Over." Static crackled, then a voice came through. "This is eastbound Crazy Eddie. What's your situation, Big John? Over?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I was seeing without sounding like I'd lost my mind? I've got a situation here, Eddie. You seen any unusual wildlife in the area? Over." "Wildlife? Nah, man, this stretch is dead this time of night. Why, what are you seeing? Over." I glanced in the mirror again. The creatures were closer now, close enough that I could make out details. Thick, matted fur, elongated snouts filled with gleaming teeth, and those eyes burning with an intelligence that had no place in an animal's gaze. I don't know how to describe it, Eddie. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Just be careful out there. Over and out." I clicked off the radio, my mind racing. What the hell was I dealing with here? Wolves didn't behave like this. Hell, no animal I knew of behaved like this. A sign flashed by. "Gas station, 5 miles. 5 miles. I could make it. Whatever these things were, They couldn't follow me into a populated area, right? The creatures were gaining ground, their powerful strides eating up the distance between us. In the mirror, I saw one of them bare its teeth in what looked disturbingly like a grin. My palms were slick with sweat on the wheel. The engine whined as I pushed it to its limits, the whole rig shuddering with the strain. But no matter how fast I went, those things kept pace. 4 miles to the gas station, 3, 2. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the roar of the engine. In the mirror, the lead creature's eyes locked with mine. There was hunger there, yes, but also something else, something almost playful. Like this was all some grand game to it. 1 mile. I could see the glow of the gas station lights in the distance. Just a little further, just a little. Something slammed into the side of the trailer. The whole rig shuddered, nearly sending me off the road. I fought the wheel, tires screaming as I struggled to maintain control. Another impact. Then another. They were attacking the trailer, trying to slow me down or tip me over. The gas station was in sight now, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. I laid on the horn, the blaring sound cutting through the night. If I could just alert someone, anyone. With a final burst of speed, I roared into the gas station lot. The brakes shrieked as I brought the rig to a shuddering halt next to a pump. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. No sounds of pursuit, no howls, no impacts against the trailer. Just the quiet hum of the gas station lights and the ping of my engine cooling down. Slowly, hesitantly, I looked in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched out empty and innocuous behind me. No sign of the creatures that had been pursuing me just moments before. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the radio. "Crazy, Eddie, you still out there? Over." A moment of static, then, "I'm here, Big John. You make it to that gas station, all right? Over." Yeah, I made it. Listen, Eddie, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think I was being chased by werewolves or something. Saw 'em clear as day in my mirror. Over." A long pause. When Eddie's voice came back, it was low and serious. "Big John, listen to me carefully. Are you alone at that gas station? Over." I glanced around. The place seemed deserted. "Yeah, just me here. Why? Over." "Get back on the road, now. Don't talk to anyone. Don't stop for anything. Just drive. Over." A chill ran down my spine. "Eddie, what's going on?" "Over." There's things out here, John. Things that ain't natural. Most folks don't see 'em, don't want to see 'em. But once they know you can, well, let's just say you don't want to stick around. Over." As if on cue, I saw movement at the edge of the lot. A shape detached itself from the shadows, then another. Wolves walking on 2 legs, their eyes gleaming in the fluorescent light. "Oh, God," I whispered. "They're here, Eddie. What do I do?" Over. "Drive, John, drive and don't look back. And whatever you do, don't let 'em catch you. Over and out." The radio went dead. I stared at it for a moment, then at the shape slowly advancing across the lot. With shaking hands, I turned the key. The engine roared to life. As I pulled out of the gas station, I caught a glimpse of the attendant finally emerging from the store. He looked right at me, then at the creatures now standing in the middle of the lot, and he smiled. It was not a human smile. I floored it, the rig's engine bellowing as I roared back onto the highway. In my mirror, I saw the creatures watch me go. They didn't pursue this time. They didn't need to. The hunt was on, and they had all the time in the world. The miles flew by as I drove through the night, my mind reeling. What had I stumbled into? What were those things? And how many others like Crazy Eddie knew about them? As dawn began to lighten the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal route, my normal life. Not now that I knew what was out there. Not now that they knew I could see them. I picked up the radio one last time. "Dispatch, this is Big John. I'm going to need some time off. Family emergency. Over." "Copy that, Big John. How long do you need? Over." I thought about those amber eyes, that too human grin, about the long, dark nights on the open road and the things that lurked in the shadows. "I don't know," I said finally, "but I'll be in touch. Over and out." I tossed the radio aside and pressed down on the accelerator. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For now, at least, I was safe. But night would fall again. And somewhere out there, a pack of creatures that defied explanation was waiting. Let them wait. I had a head start, an open road and a rig full of questions. Maybe, just maybe, I could find some answers before they found me. And if not, well, at least I'd go down knowing the truth about what really lurks in the darkness beyond our headlights. The highway stretched out before me, endless and full of possibilities. I drove on, watching the mirror less and less as the miles rolled by. Whatever was coming, I'd face it head on. After all, that's the second rule of long-haul trucking. Always keep moving forward, even when what's behind you defies all logic and reason. Even when the night is full of teeth and hunger. Even when the world you thought you knew turns out to be so much stranger and more dangerous than you ever imagined. I drove on, because sometimes that's all you can do. Drive on and hope that the road ahead holds more answers than terrors. And maybe, just maybe, find others who've seen what I've seen. Who know what I now know. The truth is out there, and so are they. All I can do now is keep driving, keep searching, and pray that when night falls again, I'm ready for whatever emerges from the shadows. Because one thing's for certain, they'll be ready for me. Be ready for